America First will be the major and overriding theme of my administration.
Donald Trump turns his focus to foreign policy. Hello, I'm Anand Naidu in Washington, D.C., and this is The Heat. Donald Trump delivered his foreign policy address covering everything from the Middle East to China and Russia and NATO's influence. His America First policy is Trump's belief of what the role of the United States should be.
Unlike other candidates for the presidency, war and aggression will not be my first instinct. You cannot have a foreign policy without diplomacy. A superpower understands that caution and restraint are really, truly signs of strength.
Well, CCTV's Nathan King is here to break it down for us. Nathan, so now that Donald Trump is focusing on international relations, what are the highlights of his policy proposals?
Well, critics will say he doesn't have one, it's just slogans. But Donald Trump's foreign policy, for him, can be summed up in those words we heard him say, America first. Not isolationist, but a re-examination of US commitments, from how much it pays to keep the NATO alliance to whether alliances like Japan and the Republic of Korea should see more burden sharing, even suggesting he has that they could develop their own nuclear deterrence, to lots of raised eyebrows. Also, staying out of the Middle East, he's even said that we should leave ISIS to Putin in the US, or if you do go in, extract some cost to pay for it. He's talked a lot about taking Iraqi oil. Although he was the first presidential candidate to actually come out against the Iraq war, he even accused the Bush administration of lying. But this America First thing fits into other areas as well, building a wall with Mexico and getting them to pay for it. Critical of Saudi Arabia as well as a free rider, but also said that he would rip up the Iran nuclear deal. So basically, it's not isolationist, but it's definitely asking questions of allies and adversaries alike.
And how does the rest of the world view Trump's candidacy? I mean, what about his foreign policy aims? How do they...
You know, worldwide, including here in the US, there was a kind of amusement, first of all, about his candidacy, wrapped up, of course, in his billionaire reality show persona. But the more he said, the more worried the world became, especially when he suggested banning Muslims. That created a lot of anger, of course, in the Middle East and Europe. The war with Mexico led one former Mexican president to use an expletive in a TV interview. And his position on trade, especially with Japan and China, has been called factually incorrect. But remember, he has a threat of trade tariffs, and that worries some up to 45%, as he said, against China. But every world leader knows this about US elections, don't they? That this is actually an election campaign. These things are said, and actually going through with suggestions like these is largely unrealistic, and also if they did, it could actually hurt the US far more than its partners. But the real question, I think, is, because Trump has had success at the ballot box, albeit in the primaries, how much of his message is actually going to be absorbed into US policy within the Congress or whoever goes into the White House? And whether he wins or not, look at trade, for example. All major candidates now are against the Trans-Pacific Partnership deal, a lot tougher language on immigration as well. And remember, Donald Trump is already picking fights with world leaders, at least verbal ones, including allies like the UK Prime Minister David Cameron.
Thanks, Nathan. That's CCTV's Nathan King reporting.
Thanks.
Now, for the first part of the show, we're focusing on the U.S. relationship with China and the Middle East. Join me now. Sun Yun is with the East Asia program at the Stimson Center, and Saha Khamis is a professor of communications at the University of Maryland. Thanks to both of you for joining us. Yun, let me start with you. Since day one of this campaign, Donald Trump has been mentioning that word China over and over again. He blames China for currency manipulation, for the deficit between the United States and China, for stealing American jobs. Are the Chinese worried about the prospect of a Trump presidency?
There's certainly a lot of China bashing coming from the Trump campaign. And people understand that there's a lot of campaign politics going on, and China bashing is always popular during a presidential election here in the United States. So I think in China, there's a sense that, well, this is business as usual. For every US presidential election, there's China bashing. And every single time, the trade issue with China, the currency manipulation, they all come up. And every single one of the candidates always promises to be tough on China. And I think Trump is no exception to that. How worried is China? To be fair, I think the Chinese policy community or the U.S. observers in China have developed this policy fatigue coming to the campaign China bashing. So they understand there are certain things about China that has to be said for a certain candidate to win in the election, but it does not necessarily indicate they're going to change U.S. policy towards China after they get elected.
Right, so is the feeling in China, as our reporter mentioned, that, this is election rhetoric. What happens when someone actually gets into the White House is something very different.
That has been certainly the experience for the Chinese.
Saha, let's talk about the Middle East.
Yes.
Donald Trump has made some, controversial statements about the Middle East. He says he's going to seize Iraq's oil, he's going to kill the families of all terrorists, he's going to ban Muslims from coming to the United States. And in what would be a departure from what other candidates have been saying and what kind of U.S. policy has been perceived as, he says he's going to be very neutral on the Israeli-Palestinian conflict.
Well, thanks again for having me on the show, and it's always a pleasure to be on The Heat. I think the word amusement, which Nathan mentioned in his remark, really kind of caught my attention, because this is really coming into some kind of political circus that we are seeing here. This is not a foreign policy in any way, shape, or form that can prove to be based on any kind of rationale or any kind. There is a lot of superficial statements that he is making, which promise to bring back a new phase of foreign policy disasters in the region, American foreign policy disasters in the region. The policy of America first and making America great again really is going to boil down to a new form of bullying that's going to cause the United States a lot of damage to its own credibility and resources and image abroad and reputation. Things like the claim to seize Iraqi oil and kill the families of terrorists and all of that stuff, and of course banning Muslims from entering the U.S. and taking a position against Muslims very Islamophobically in the media over and over again. These are all things that really hurt the image and reputation and credibility of the U.S. abroad, and especially in the Middle East, big time. So he seems to lack the vision and the insight and the depth, and to really kind of usher an era of disastrous failure for U.S. foreign policy in the Middle East region.
Point is that, amusing, as you said superficial as well, putting America first, etc. But what he is doing is actually resonating with a significant part of the U.S. population.
Which is the most scary part of it all. I mean, his rhetoric, as awkward and ridiculous as it is, does not scare me as much as the fact that it does ring a bell and it does resonate with a portion or a segment of the American public who are obviously cheering him up and clapping for him, and obviously these would be the people who are going to go to the poll and vote for him. And that is very scary. We cannot just turn a blind eye to this reality that playing on people's fears and the kind of propaganda that he is using, as as hollow and as shallow as it is, does strike a chord with a certain portion and segment of the population who are very fearful of the word Islam and Muslim. And of course, this is coupled with ignorance about the faith and the people, the 1.6 billion people who follow it. But the fact is, as you said, there are people who are going to be voting for him. If he ever makes it to the final stage of the election, I certainly hope not. But that in itself is a very scary signal.
Right, Yun, as we said, Trump is very critical of China bashing, as you mentioned. He has said things like, we can't allow China to rape our country. Yet at the same time, he says, I want to improve relations with China. I want to strengthen this relationship. Is that a mixed message there?
There are a lot of inconsistencies in terms of Trump's foreign policy statements. So sure, U.S. as a global power, U.S. wants everything. U.S. wants to be the leader, but U.S. doesn't want to pay for it. U.S. wants to negotiate with China, but on the other hand, U.S. wants to maintain good relationship with China. So for a candidate, it is certainly okay that he has all these aspirations and all these foreign policy goals. But I think if he does become the country, then he will realize that there are gives and takes in U.S. foreign policy, and it is simply not possible for the country to have everything. Especially for an important relationship like U.S.-China relations, there are a lot of issues that U.S. and China compete with each other on, and they do not necessarily agree with each other on. But there are also a lot of issues that they will benefit from cooperation with each other. So by asserting a hardline policy on China and make it an overarching theme of his China policy, we will have to see how practical it will be after he does become the president, if he does win.
So let's talk about some of the possible consequences of what Trump has been saying. The former CIA director, Michael Hayden, said recently on Al Jazeera that Trump's rhetoric on the Middle East and on Islam as well would make the United States a bigger target for Islamic radicals. Let's watch. and then we'll get to you.
When Mr. Trump says some of the things that he has said, they all hate us, we shouldn't let any of those people in our country. What he does is underscore and underpin the fundamentals of their narrative of undying enmity. You don't have to be president. You don't have to get to be president for that kind of statement from someone so prominent in the American political system to have already made Americans less safe.
Is that true? Is that going to happen?
Absolutely very true. Actually, it's working in two very dangerous directions in parallel. On one hand, it is increasing the safety risks for Muslim communities who have come physically, not just emotionally or psychologically, but physically under attack by people who are Islamophobic and already fearful. And of course the Trump rhetoric has been definitely increasing these incidents of attacks and assault on Muslim communities. Mosques and Islamic centers have been attacked. Muslim women have had the hijab pulled over from their heads, a slander, libel, teenager thrown off from a building and being killed. I mean, horrific incidents of real dangers and threats to Muslims in America as a result of this rhetoric. This is one line. The other line is definitely increasing the risk of extremism and radicalization is definitely another threat, because he's exactly playing into the hands of the radicals and extremists. This is exactly what they want to hear. They want to hear a president who would say things like, Islam is the enemy, Islam hates us, right? And this is exactly what the kind of narrative and rhetoric that they would love to hear, because it plays into their hands. So he's giving them exactly the kind of tools and reasons and excuses to actually launch more hateful attacks and to really cause some kind of major threat to the security of this country.
Right, and talk about inconsistencies. He also was opposed to the Iraq war. He said Bush was lying. This was a huge mistake that the United States made.
I mean, that is very interesting. I mean, he does not have much credibility in my eyes, obviously. So I do not really believe much of what he is saying, and I don't know how much of a truth he has in it. But equally, when he says things like, I'm going to be neutral towards the Arab-Israeli conflict or the Palestinian-Israeli conflict, I mean, he has been making some, very blunt and shameless statements which are completely pro-Israeli and very much not really acknowledging the rights of the Palestinian people. I mean, the U.S. administration successively, in many different administrations, have taken a position which is more siding and more biased to the Israeli side at the expense of the Palestinians. This is not something new. But for it to be all that obvious, all that blunt, all that shameless is really the kind of rhetoric we are seeing coming out of Trump. And, this is something, again, which is very scary and very threatening.
There is one view that we hear out of China. We hear from some quarters in China, look, we shouldn't be too worried about this. He is pro-business. That's all that matters. Let's take a listen.
Fixing our relations with China is another important step in really toward creating a even more prosperous period of time. China respects strength, and by letting them take advantage of us economically, which they are doing like never before, we have lost all of their respect. We have a trade deficit with China.
Is that closer to reality, what he's talking about there?
There's a certain, that is certainly a perception that's quite popular among some population here in the United States, that China has been exploiting the United States and China only understands strengths. But the question for the U.S. foreign policy is, so what do we do about that?
Right.
Do we just simply put on a confrontational poster and push back and push our bilateral relationship to the brinks of a war? Or we work with China constructively? I think most of the presidents in the United States have preferred the second approach, rather than just claim to be confrontational and claim to be forceful when dealing with China.
So no matter what happens in the election, we don't know whether Trump's going to be the president or not, whether he's going to be the losing candidate. But has he changed the debate on foreign policy in this country?
I think he did. I mean, the rhetoric that we are seeing in this interesting presidential campaign is really unprecedented. I mean, when you think about it and you see the kind of rhetoric that the candidates have been adopting, and it's not just Trump, look at what, Ted Cruz has been making, some of the claims, really, I mean, we have been hearing a lot of very, quote unquote, interesting rhetoric in this presidential campaign like never before. This campaign has been very interesting. And I think that the whole debate has been changing. And I think that the good side, which is coming out of all this, or the light at the end of the tunnel, is that some people are starting to say, wait a minute, this is becoming way too farcical. It's becoming way too ridiculous. It is becoming way too shameful, even to the image of the United States abroad and its reputation in the eyes of the international community. What should be done in order to return back again to the area of possible reason and moderation and sensibility? And I think this is the good which is coming out of all of this bad.
Okay, we're going to have to leave it there for now. Thanks to both of you for joining us.
Thank you so much.
very much.
Thank you.
We are going to take a break right now. Coming up, Russians are a big fan of Donald Trump. We'll have one Russian perspective. Plus, Trump had some strong words for Europe's biggest allies in Europe. Our panel weighs in next. Stay with us. You're watching The Heat. Welcome back. We're talking about the foreign policy of Donald Trump and its potential impact, whether he wins or loses. For the view on Russia and European relations, from London, we're joined by Alexander Nekrasov. He is a former advisor to the Russian government, and Holger Stark is the Washington correspondent for Der Spiegel. Thanks to both of you for joining us. Alexander, let's talk about Trump's policy on Russia. He likes and respects President Vladimir Putin. He thinks Putin is a leader. He's also said that he thinks that Ukraine is a European problem. What does one make of these sentiments? I mean, are Russian-US relations going to get a lot better if he becomes president?
Well, first of all, to be honest, it can't get worse than under Obama. So let's face it, that, you know, people in the Kremlin and Mr. Putin are having a chuckle on the one hand, listening to Mr. Trump. But on the other hand, they understand that they have to wait for the new president. With Obama, it's a no-go situation. And I don't even know how, you know, how worse it can get. So to say that the Russians are supporting Trump and want him to win, I don't think so. I mean, I personally, I'm enjoying this farce with the elections. I'm enjoying what Mr. Trump is doing to the grand old party. And I think the whole system of elections in America is being seen through a different light with him, because it has become ridiculous, to be honest. You know, the country which purports to be the beacon of freedom of the world has one of the most corrupt systems of election of its president, with billions of dollars thrown in, with the media basically deciding for the people who is the best candidate. And for what it was, 140 million people didn't vote in the last presidential elections in America. So yes, it's a circus, but some of the things that Mr. Trump says make sense, because what is happening now as regards Russia and American policy towards Russia, it is total chaos. And I don't think anyone in the Kremlin or in the Russian government sees any possibility of improving these relations. Okay, we had a bit of luck, I would say. I would call it luck, actually, with America and Russia doing a deal over Syria. But that was just a small thing in the wider picture of things. But as regards Ukraine, for example, which is a very troublesome development, and I don't think that this crisis will be sorted out soon. I think Obama's policy towards Ukraine is basically devastating, destructive, and it is technically pushing the world to a third world war in Europe.
Right.
So on the one hand, it's entertaining. On the other hand, it's really very depressing.
Right. Holger, the closest allies of the United States are to be found in the countries of Europe. Yet Trump's view is that Europe is getting a free ride from the United States. Let's take a listen to what he said about that.
Our allies are not paying their fair share. Our allies must contribute toward their financial, political, and human costs, have to do it, of our tremendous security burden. But many of them are simply not doing so. They look at the United States as weak and forgiving and feel no obligation to honor their agreements with us.
How does Europe feel when they hear statements like that?
Well, something between disturbed, concerned, irritated. They watch what's going on in America, and they basically don't understand what it is about. It's not that foreign policy is just like a marketplace where you run a business. It's about bigger values. And there is this bigger Western part of the world which has been unified for like 60, 70 years since World War II. And there's a strong alliance between the European countries like Germany and the United States. And America has always been the leader of that free part of the Western world. And suddenly Trump is questioning all that. He's challenging to get out of the NATO, which is probably the strongest military alliance the world has ever seen. Why? Because Europe is not paying enough. Europe is paying on different fields. Europe is paying for refugees, in the migrant crisis. Europe is standing close to the United States when it comes to the Ukraine crisis. And allow me to respectfully disagree with Alexander. I think it can get much more worse than under Obama. If Trump is realizing what he's saying, then he basically is breaking down that Western alliance.
Just getting back to what you said a moment ago, I mean, as you point out, there was this security architecture, if we could call it that was put in place after the Cold War ended, which is what it looks like right now. Is that going to be undone by Donald Trump?
If he is going to realize what he's saying right now, I would say yes, because could count on America. What would happen in Syria? He's claiming that he would bomb the ISIS positions. Yeah. But he wouldn't interfere. What would happen with the migrant crisis? He definitely wouldn't participate in any kind of support of that. What would happen in the Ukraine? He would leave Europe alone. What's the address? What's the message to the Eastern European countries like the Baltic states? You're on your own. So he is not showing any kind of solidarity. I think that's not in his DNA to stand to someone just because of his values. He's driven by his capitalist idea of running an enterprise, dealing with people. I think he's an isolationist who's showing flexing muscles to make deals and not to stand allied next to friends.
Alexander, let's take a listen to what Donald Trump thinks of President Putin. Let's watch this.
He's a very colorful person, talented without a doubt, but it's not our affair to determine his worthiness. That's up to the US voters. But he is absolutely the leader in the presidential race. He wants to move to a different level of relations, to more solid, deeper relations with Russia. And how can Russia not welcome that? We welcome that.
Actually, what I meant to say was that's Vladimir Putin's view of Donald Trump. Why does President Putin like him so much?
Well, to be honest with you, I think Mr. Putin is trying to tempt Mr. Obama more than Mr. Trump, because it's a tongue-in-cheek characterization, and I can assure you that in the Kremlin they understand all this farcical side of the election campaign in America. It's just that occasionally Donald Trump says something which makes sense, and makes sense for Russian ear. And for example, when he says that NATO has outlived itself, which it did, because NATO is an anti-Russian, well, anti-Soviet, but now anti-Russian aggressive pact. It's not a defensive pact anymore. After Ukraine and what happened in the Baltics and so on, after these countries were joined NATO, right. It has now become obvious that NATO has become aggressive. So you see, elements of what he says make sense. On the whole, of course, this is not a serious foreign policy manifesto, and it remains to be seen what will happen when he takes on Hillary Clinton, if he actually gets the nomination.
Okay. Holger, let me ask you this very quickly. Is Europe going to take another look at its relationship with the United States? Because whether Donald Trump is elected or not, I mean, the point is that Europeans must be sensitive and aware of the fact that what he says has some currency among people in the United States.
Well, there's clearly this view that America has to withdraw from the world's conflicts, and that Donald Trump is appealing to and representing in the American public. I think for the Europeans, it couldn't be a more radical decision. Hillary Clinton, who would stand for a long-term tradition in American foreign policy, and Donald Trump, who's standing for the opposite, who would withdraw, who would step back, who would probably get out of a couple of alliances. So European leaders are significantly concerned. They reach out in secret to Trump's people to find out if it's for sure what he's saying, if he will do that or not. And everybody is begging that either she will be elected, or that he is saying something that he's not meaning at the end.
Because the general feeling here in the United States is what this election campaign so far has thrown up is that people are saying, we do not want business as usual.
Right. I think we're really at a crossroads, and this will be extremely interesting what's going on the next month.
Great. Holger Stark, Alexander Nekrasov, thanks to both of you for joining us. That's all we have time for. I'm Anand Naidu in Washington, D.C. Thanks for being with us. Thank you so much. Sorry.